speaker, the next presenter, Patrick. Now we move from Warsaw to Munich, Germany. Patrick will be analyzing the detail of the side quest secret trial in the 2018 video game Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And so, Patrick, I'm happy to see you. You're welcome on board. And so you have 15 minutes to give us your presentation. Thank you. You have the floor.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this kind introduction and for this great opportunity to present my paper. Today, I would like to present your quest from the video game Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which was released in 2018. In doing so, I want to show how numerous quotations from Plato's philosophical dialogues are incorporated into this pop cultural game. Therefore, I will first briefly describe the story that the quest tells. After that, I will analyze two central aspects or texts in more detail. First, the prophecy of the Pythia in Plato's Apology of Socrates, and second, the myth of Theof in the Phaedrus. Before I recount the quest briefly, for those who aren't familiar with the game, a rough summary. In the game, you are in control of a Greek mercenary during the time of the Peloponnesian War, roughly from 431 BC to 421. In search of your own family's roots, you travel all over Greece, meet important persons of the ancient world such as Herodotus, Socrates, Pericles, Sophocles, Euripides, or the Spartan commander Brasidas, but you also encounter various mythological figures, for example, the Nemean lion, the Sphinx, the Medusa, or even individual gods such as Hermes or Hades. To put it briefly, the game content is far too extensive to mention everything here. The quest I will now describe belongs to the optional expansion pack Lost Tales of Greece. From a narratological perspective, therefore, the title already relativizes the historicity of the events depicted and emphasizes the lack of historical source material. In this way, the quests of Lost Tales of Greece exemplify the multi-layered alternation between fictionality and historicity that characterizes the entire game. The quest, Socrates' Trial, is divided into 5 parts. A Socratic Mass, Finding One's Voice, Persuasion Check, Deposition Opposition, and You're Such a Socrates. In a Socratic Mass, the player meets Socrates' wife, Xantippe, near the Oracle of Delphi. You talk about Alcibiades and Socrates and learn that Socrates has not returned after a symposium. When a witness appears and announces that Socrates has been arrested, you go to the prison to talk to Socrates. Here, the parallels to Plato's Apology of Socrates, Phaedo, and Crito are already obvious to the literary educated player. In a conversation with the player, Socrates calmly explains the reason for his arrest. He says, "Speaking my mind," and therefore expects to be acquitted. The sovereignty he shows in the legal processes, which is characteristic of the Apology of Socrates in particular, is projected by the play onto Socrates some 20 years before his actual arrest. Already here, he can refer to me when he declares that he will use the time in prison for philosophical self-examination. In the second part, Finding One's Voice, the player meets the Pythia asking her for the correct interpretation of the prophecy. Afterwards, the player meets a student of Socrates, whose lecture manuscripts are to be the central piece of evidence in the upcoming trial. The content of the texts remain unknown. In Persuasion Check, the player convinces some other philosophers to support Socrates in his trial. As a central argument, the player refers to the freedom of speech, the Greek parousia. After that, a young boy named Aristocles, who later wants to become a pupil of Socrates, emerges from the background. In the conversation with the player, he says that he wants to change his name to Plato, Here, the game takes up the story known through Diogenes Laertius and Apuleius that the most famous pupil of Socrates was originally called Aristocles, and thus clearly establishes the reference to the Platonic dialogues for the literary educated player. Plato's appearance does not serve the progress of the story, but must be understood as a cross-genre pretextual allusion. In the next part, deposition-opposition, the bloody and combative aspects come to the fore. The player must eliminate Socrates' opponents and destroy the false evidence. After that, in You're Such a Socrates, you meet Socrates again, who has been released from prison in the meantime. Socrates is still thinking about the Pythias saying, turning in his famous "I know that I know nothing," Greek oida within eidos. In tragic irony, the player warns of a similar trial in Athens, but Socrates ignores this warning. As the conversation proceeds, the broad literary background of the quest again becomes apparent. When the player addresses Socrates about his wife Xantippe, the latter quotes himself, so to speak, from Xenophon's Symposium. He's enthusiastic about the discussions he had together with Xantippe and calls her an untamed horse. When the player hands Socrates the lecture notes prepared by his student, Socrates throws them into the fire. Asked about the reason for this surprising reaction, he recounts the tale myth from Plato's Phaedrus, with which the quest ends. As already mentioned, I would now like to analyze the transformation of the Platonic dialogues into the narrative of the video game in more detail. First, let's have a look at the prophecy of the Pythia. A brief explanation in advance. At the beginning of the video, the Pythia speaks of a cult. During the main story of the game, you have to destroy a secret organization called the Cult of Cosmos, because it controls political events in Greece and, among other things, also abuses the Pythia for its own purposes. I hope that works.
You told Socrates something, and I want to know why.
Questioning why the Pythia speaks is a strange thing.
I know why you speak, and I know who controls your voice. Tell me why the cult had you tell Socrates he's the wisest.
The cult didn't tell me to say that. I did that on my own.
The cult wouldn't allow you to do that.
Which is why I was very careful. I seek Socrates as an ally, but simply asking him to help wouldn't have worked.
An ally for what?
I know much of Socrates. Not only has he visited me often, but his students do as well.
Get to the point.
You know the gods don't speak through me. I feel Socrates is the one who can convince others of this. If he succeeds, the cult will have no more need for me.
So you're hoping he comes to the conclusion that the gods don't exist?
It matters not if Socrates believes they exist. He needs simply to doubt that the gods speak through me.
I understand why you think Socrates can help, but why tell him he's the wisest?
He'll delve into what it means to be wisest. It's my hope he'll conclude he's not, and therefore doubt the words of the gods.
If you just told him your words aren't from the gods, wouldn't that serve the same purpose? And much quicker?
Socrates is not the type to desire the answer so easily. He'll have more drive when he finds the answer on his own.
This is getting complicated.
The central pretext is, of course, the apology of Socrates. I'll read it to you in Greek. Kai depote kai estelfus elton etolmese tutum antvoisastan, kai hopper lego me torbete andres. Erato garde etis in due sofoteros. Anhelen unhepitia medena sofoteron einan. Kai tuton periho adelfos femino tuho tosima tyrese. Epede ekenos titiloiteken. Skepsas de hon heneca tauta lego. Melogar humas didaxen hoten moi he diabolege gegonen. Tautargar ego accusas in etymumen hotusi. Tipote lege hoteos. Kai tipote aniteten. Ego gar de ute mega utis migronse neuda emotoso fos on. Tiun potelege fascon emesa fortaton enan. Uga depu pseudetage. Uga temis autor. The play varies Plato's version of the prophecy in several places. Instead of Chaerephon, Socrates himself is at Delphi and asks the Pythia. The prophecy itself remains unchanged. The Greek Medena Sophoteron Einai corresponds to Socrates' rendition of the prophecy, none is wiser. The great advantage for the player is that he does not have to engage in an interpretation of the enigmatic saying. He can simply ask the Pythia, with which the latter comments ironically. Questioning why the Pythia speaks is a strange thing. This is followed by the most essential change from the ancient pretext. Embedded in the story of the play, the Pythia is not a religious authority who acts as a medium for Apollo's divinations. The cult of Cosmos instrumentalizes her for political purposes. According to the in-game Pythia, Socrates should therefore not believe the saying Medena Sophoteron Einai. But whereas in the apology of Socrates, his distrust is directed against his fellow man, in Assassin's Creed, the Pythia wants him to doubt the source of the prophecy. She believes that his social influence is so high that the rest of the Greek people would also lose faith in the Pythia because of Socrates' doubts. From a historical point of view, this influence of Socrates must be rejected. The game thus takes up essential elements from the apology of Socrates, but changes them decisively through the religion-critical perspective. For the literary educated player, this results in added value, since the game ironically presents Socrates' search for divine truth as a misinterpretation. I come to my second example.
I just remembered. A student of yours has been taking notes of your teachings. He wanted you to have them. What did you do that for?
Nobody asked him to write down my words.
Even so, why not keep it? Share it with others.
Because of a story I was told as a boy.
All right, let's hear it.
The king of Egypt, Thamos, was visited by the god Thephtha. Thephtha offered the invention of writing to the king and told him it was an elixir of memory and wisdom. But Thamos disagreed. He believed the people would no longer use their memories, for they would simply read instead. These written words would not offer true wisdom, but only the appearance of such.
You don't want your own words written down, so others can't use them to pretend to be smart.
Much like creatures in a painting, the words sit there unmoving. If you ask them a question, they will preserve a solemn silence. And no matter how many times you ask, they will only ever say the same thing. They cannot defend their message.
That's the part you like. The defense of your words.
All who speak should defend their words if questioned about them. That is why I choose to speak and not write. That is why any words of mine that last beyond my final breath will be those that people choose to remember. Those words will be true wisdom and not an illusion.
As is well known, Plato has Socrates narrate the tale of myth in the Phaedrus, again the Greek text. Kanun sui pater on grammaton dioinoian to anantion apes edunatan. Tutogarton matonton laetemen in psychais parexe nemes amelethesia. Hatte diapistin graphes exoten hyp allotrion typon uk endoten autus hyp auton anonymes comenus. Uk un nemes alla hypomnesios pharmacon voires. Sophias de tois matetais doxa, uk alethean poritseis. Polyeko oi garzoi genomenoi anoi didaches, polygonomonos einai doxosin, agnomones hos epitopletos ontes, kai chalipoisin einai, doxosophoi gegonotes antisophon. And later in the discussion with Phaedrus, Deinon garpu o phaedre tut eche graphe, kai hos aletos homoion zographia. cargata ekenes econa hestike men host zonta, iande an ereti sem nos panusiga. Tauton de kai hoilogo. Doxais men an hosti fronuntas autus lege, eandite ereton legomenon bulomenos maten, henti semain ne monon tauton ae. Plen melumenos de kai uk endike loidoretes, tu patros ae deitai boitu. Autoscar ut amynastai ute boitesa dynatos autor. While the example of the apology of Socrates is interesting, in my opinion, because of its deviations from Plato's pretext, here we partly see literal quotation that suggests a close examination of the ancient text by the game developers. The retelling of the myth is narratological altered, but the in-game Socrates reproduces all the essential content. The Egyptian king Thamos reinterprets the supposedly helpful invention of writing. In truth, it will harm people's memory and make them polygnomonos docuntes, but akonomones ontes. Among philological and philosophical researchers, this myth occupies a central position as it is one of the central texts for the adoption of the unwritten doctrines, the agrapha dogmata of Plato. The question arises why Plato criticizes the medium in which he formulates his philosophy. In the narrative design of the game, this problem does not arise. Socrates, as a quasi-historical person, can, unlike the Platonic dialogue figure, criticize writing as a medium without contradiction. In the subsequent interpretation of the myth, it also becomes clear how strongly the developers have taken the cue from the Platonic text. Much like creatures in a painting takes up homoion zographia, they will preserve a solemn silence, takes up semnos panusiga. They will only ever say the same thing, takes up henti semaine monon tauton ae, and they cannot defend their message takes up autoscar ut amynastai, ute boetesai dynatos autor. This gives the literary educated player the interesting fiction of being able to witness live Socrates formulating those considerations that are eventually represented in Plato's dialogues. On the other side, I think that the tale of myth, because of its special content, can motivate the other players to research the literary sources of the story themselves. To summarize briefly, the quest Socrates trial moves the trial from 399 before Christ forward by about 20 years and from Athens to Delphi. This opens up the possibility of presenting the contents of the Platonic writings as historical facts. The game partly refers exactly to these contents, at other points it varies them greatly. Therefore, the game can be used in schools, for example, to interest pupils in Socratic and Platonic thought in a modern medium, and then initiate a critical comparison of the game and the text.